Okay, we'll get going again. Well, Rash and then tá sé óintach seo a bheith an seo ag ggóúidir libse ar fad agus ag obair leis an rinn agus le Coláis na Hallscoil Blactia. It's really great to be here. It's great to have everybody here and this partnership that we have going on. I'm from Maynooth University, Seán Foghlú is my name. With UCD and the department is really great. So, everybody's very welcome. We had a lot of talk this morning, and it was all very interesting. And there's a real buzz, and in our fairly tight surroundings, tight and historical surroundings. And what we're going to do now is bring little snippets from a diverse group of, I would probably say, innovators in this area, just 5 nearly completely different perspectives. And it's really to help people realize that we couldn't fit everybody in, even though we have a very full agenda on the range of different approaches and the different activities underway. So we have 5 really interesting perspectives from people who are active in this area in different ways. And they're going to have just a maximum of 5 minutes each, and they're just here to convey what they're doing, and you can reflect on it, and we can talk about it if issues can come up in the dialogue later on, or indeed at tea break and so on. So I'm going to introduce them turn by turn, but we have first up Professor Michelle Norris, who's the Director of UCD Geary Institute.
Thank you, Seán, and thanks to colleagues from Maynooth and GCD for inviting me to speak. So Seán mentioned I'm Director of the Geary Institute for Public Policy in UCD. So the Geary Institute is one of 7 research institutes in UCD that support research in a range of different areas across the university. And as its name implies, the Geary Institute for Public Policy supports policy-relevant research in the social and behavioural sciences. So we provide accommodation and support for colleagues who are involved in research in that area, provide training, run seminars and conferences. And in recent years, we have also radically expanded our activity in relation to policy impact and our collaborative work with colleagues in the policy making and implementation system. So and we plan to further expand this work, and we've captured our objective in our new strategic plan, which we called Empowering Policy Excellence, or EPICS for short. So I've just included a list of the objectives of the strategic plan and how they relate in particular to supporting research for policy. So our objectives are to continue to support excellent research for policy, and we have 270 members around GCD who are involved in that area. Strengthen connections between researchers and policy professionals, disseminate research evidence for policy, enable researchers to maximise their policy impact. We're also working to collaborate with policy institutes across other universities in Europe, North America and Australia. And another key objective of the strategic plan is to strengthen policy professional skills and knowledge. So they're the objectives of what we're doing. So I just want to then briefly just outline some of the activities we're involved in to achieve those objectives. So one of the things the Institute does is we host a research for policy dissemination platform called publicpolicy.ie. So it publishes short 2,000 or 3,000 word papers that summarise the results of policy relevant research and outline the policy implications. So we publish around 50 papers a year. We're expecting about 50 papers a year across a whole wide range of areas. These are just some recent ones. You can see on the slide we've published in relation to ageing. We've done a lot in climate policy, environmental policy, etc. So we are as well as colleagues from UCD, we're very happy to take papers from all the universities in Ireland, and we have very active participants from Maynooth in particular. I can see some colleagues here who've given us papers, so thank you very much. And from UCC, from Trinity, and we'd really like to widen that. So please contact us if you're interested in participating. Also, as part of our Empowering Policy Excellence programme, we established last year an expert residency programme. It's an opportunity for policymakers and implementers to come and spend a period in the Institute of 3 to 6 months and write an expert reflection on a particularly knotty policy challenge they faced during their career, or some issue that was on their mind, and there was no opportunity to write it up in their role. So you can see the picture in the middle is at the launch of the first expert residency, which was by Bob Jordan, who's a former CEO of the Housing Agency, and he did his residency on the theme of thinking systemically about solving homelessness. And we had a really useful workshop on that area and on systemic thinking. As part of our efforts to increase collaboration with the policymaking system and also increase skills in the policymaking system, we are planning a programme of micro-credentials, short courses aimed at policymakers and implementers. So that's currently under development. And we have plans as part of that to launch a professional certificate programme in policy and innovation that will be offered in a blended way, online and in person, and in kind of block delivery targeting civil and public servants. And then finally, this year, we also launched a webinar series called Inspiring Policy Innovation, which is the third Thursday of every month. And it's short presentations on new ideas on policy making, policy design. It's targeting civil servants, but also students in public policy are very welcome to come. It's free. And the idea was to try to throw new ideas into the policy system on how you improve policy making and implementation. So that's the work of the Institute. We're very interested in collaborating more widely, so please contact us if you're interested in working with us. And just to acknowledge the support from UCD for our activities, from the Vice President for our Research Office and also for the Vice President from Strategy. Thank you.
It's nearly like a game, limiting people like Michelle to 5 minutes. So well done, Michelle. And torture for you. So we're going to move on now with Sinead Mullen, who's the Senior Planner of Research, Training and Public Awareness in the Office of the Planning Regulator.
Thanks, Seán, and thanks very much for inviting us here. We're very humbled to be in this room with such illustrious researchers. Some of you are probably saying, who is the OPR and who are we? We're not the OPW. We don't ask any questions about bicycle sheds, please. And if you're Googling us there, we are not associated with Oprah Winfrey. She pops up first on the list. So that's not us. But what we are is we were established on foot of the Mahon Tribunal. So quite a serious past. But therein, in 2012, the Mahon Tribunal reported that there was need for an independent planning regulator to look into and investigate systems in the system and also provide education and training, because when you know better, you do better, as they say. So we have 3 key functions. I'll just touch on them briefly. The first one is the evaluation of statutory plans. That's the development plans that guide development and the environmental contract that we have between planning and the public. Our planning reviews and examination team, and they examine the systems and procedures and how things are working within planning authorities and on board Planola or Commission Planola. And then our team is the probably lesser heard of team, education, training, research, and all those good things. You will probably have heard of some of our roles, maybe in terms of the anti-wind farm policies that we have tried require that not to zone land. And just for balance, not everybody loves the regulator. So, you know, there have been calls and criticisms of us in relation to using housing numbers. And just to say, the housing numbers, you know, I don't think anybody could have predicted what happened over the past few years, and that we implement the policy of government. So just, you know, for balance, I suppose, moving on, our statutory remit is in relation to why we're here today, to conduct research in relation to matters relevant to our functions and also at the request of the Minister. So we have on occasion been invited to undertake research by the Minister to support him in his functions. Now we're a small team, very small team by comparison. We're a bit of a minnow compared to many in the room, but we do try and you know, have an effect. And at the very outset of our organisation back in 2019, we established our planning research framework to identify, similar to Michelle, goals, objectives, what research we were going to do, how we were going to deliver it on small budgets, and how we were going to work with some of you in this room to identify our types of outputs. We very much wanted our work to have an influence on the planning system and the decision makers, and actually how policy is not only made but how it is implemented. So that's sort of our architecture behind our function and our work. And we don't do that alone. We have a national plan and knowledge group, which maybe I think we might have to retitle it the brokerage group. So we have the higher educational institutes, we have government departments, housing agency, local government, planning institutes, NESC, EPA, IBEC, with a few others in there. So they all guide us in where we should be doing our research so that we are filling a gap, we're being effective. Now, as we're limited time this afternoon, I just maybe focus on two specific pieces of research that we've carried out over the last few years. And I can see Brian in the audience there. So one of the first pieces that we commissioned due to the pressing climate agenda was a look at a case study analysis that we did with Mary, and it looked at development plans and how the climate agenda was being advanced or not through development plans. So that was a very important piece of work. It was capacity building within the planning system, but also a look at how things could improve, because effectively the climate agenda and the planning system go hand in hand. We need to put things in the right places, and that's possibly half the battle. And any of we've heard discussions this morning about making the move away from fossil fuels. Any of the climate actions will have to at some point go through the planning system, and the planning system needs to be ready to facilitate and enable that. So that was a very important piece of work that we undertook with Mary, and hopefully it has had good effect. Another important piece that we've developed last year, that we published last year, related to brownfield land activation. It was an evidence-based piece. It's quite a big piece, literature review. We had empirical interviews with people who are actually delivering in Ireland on brownfield sites to hear what the issues are, so that we could feed that back into the policy agenda. We identified 6 action areas and key opportunities, and it was published last year just at a point in time when the Planning Act was under review, the National Planning Framework was under review. So we hit it at the right time, we feel. So those are kind of 2 examples of our work. The brownfield land activation, we work together with NESC. I don't know if there's anybody on the room or online, but we worked with NESC, we worked with the housing agency, and we were all looking at complementary research pieces, but we wanted to work together so that we were not competing. And that suite of research fed into a NESC report, which, as we all know, NESC report directly to the Taoiseach's office. So that was a massive input, we feel, to the broader agenda. And now we wouldn't want to purport to take credit for all the changes, but we do think that we've contributed to the conversation and to hopefully some of the improvements that you will have seen to the National Planning Framework earlier this year, where there is a much more strong evidenced metric targets in relation to renewables and actions in relation to brownfield, just on those 2 particular case studies. So that's research to policy and hopefully into action as well.
We're going to move on with Teresa Maguire, who's the Director of Research Strategy and Funding with the health research world.
Thanks very much for the invite. I'm delighted to be here and really learning a lot. I'm going to annoy you all by telling you in 5 minutes what I'm not going to cover, because actually I've heard so much already today from other funders and others around the house. And I also, looking at the rest of the programme, I know some themes are going to come up. So what I will say is, importantly, in the Health Research Board, where we fund health and social care research, and I'm speaking from the funders' perspective, when we talk about evidence for policy, we are also talking about evidence for policy in the department, but also for the health, all those decision makers in the healthcare system. We've got a delivery system of, I'm conscious Chris is in the room, economists. I'm going to say 120,000 plus staff. It's a contentious issue, as you could imagine. But it's really, really important. And I don't think we've cracked that nut yet, not by a long stretch. And it's something we'd really like to share with others in the room. What we have learned over the years is, I suppose, in a sense, we sort of have a head start, if you want to call it that, in health, because evidence-based medicine has been around since 1981, since that term was coined by McMaster in Canada. What I would say is that takes us so far. And we're still doing that work around clinical guidelines and clinical practice and so on. But evidence-based medicine is not the same as evidence-informed policy and decision-making. So that's just important. And I know I'm preaching to the converted, but it's something that I suppose over the last 10 or 15 years has become really, really clear to us. I'm not going to talk about all of the models and initiatives that we fund on the absorptive capacity, the research capacity side, the importance of inter and transdisciplinary research. It's been touched on today, but feasibility, acceptability, inclusion and diversity in the research we do, the relevance and the acceptability of that. And I think, you know, we played a leadership role in PPI and stakeholder engagement. Indeed, we require decision makers and knowledge users to be part of the grants that we fund. They're on the governance structures. They're not just on the side. We've moved from talking about dissemination to integrated knowledge translation. Again, something we've heard a lot here. And they're all important points. But in the time that I have left, I really wanted to focus on maybe two aspects that I felt may not have come through as much. John, you kindly introduced the audience to the importance of evidence synthesis when you're starting to look at a policy question. And that's something that I do want to talk about, because the point before that about prioritization mechanisms and eliciting maybe where the gaps are, the evidence gaps are for policymakers, has been really clear to us in the last 10 or 20 years since we started funding Cochrane Ireland for everybody. And we were really thinking about the practice environment, not really about the policy environment at the outset of that. It became really, really clear that over 80% of the gaps, the evidence gaps that are required, could be handled by synthesis of existing evidence, perhaps contextualized, an expression that came up earlier, really, really important. And the other point that I just want to leave with you is data, and infrastructure and systems to access and link and securely move data. And this is to complement the work that is going on by the OGCIO and around the public sector data strategy, virtual data rooms and so on. But I'm talking about the data that is collected every hour, every day, as patients and families interact with our health and social care system, waiting lists, workforce, not enough on outcomes, but hype, all sorts of information systems that are collected. And when we shifted to fund health services systems and policy research, we were really, really struck by the number of questions. We all agreed on the questions. We couldn't answer some of the questions. We couldn't do value for money analysis because we couldn't link all of the data sets. And so this is really, really important, and an area that thankfully hopefully we'll be able to say a lot more about in the coming years, because the EU data strategy, the move to health data spaces, or data spaces of which health data space is the leader, the department are leading a piece of work, a really, really important work that I think has potential to be a game changer for policy and practice in health. To establish a health data access body needs to be operational by 2030. Whether you're a policymaker, a planner, or a researcher, you will be able to submit your requests for data in about 50 categories. through a secure health data access body, to go onto a portal, to do your analysis and so on, and to answer those questions. And you can get access to data across the EU through that same hub. So I just wanted to leave that there as something that is really, really critical. And I know I'm speaking on behalf of the policymakers as well in his unit, but that's something that's happening in the system, and I think we need to talk about. And finally, just to say a point around evidence synthesis, there's a really, really exciting initiative that we're involved in at the moment that has evolved over the years, from systematic reviews to scoping reviews to evidence briefs to more rapid products. But actually, it is now taking a completely step change, fueled by the Wellcome Trust and an initiative called the Evidence Synthesis Infrastructure Collaborative, or ESIC. I have a web link on the next page for you. And this is really about joining our national assets and support units, of which we have invested in Ireland, certainly in the health space, with similar units like the WHO Evidence Commissioning Unit, the ECDC Commissioning Unit, the Johns Hopkins Commissioning Unit, McMaster, who coined the phrase evidence-based medicine. And we've all agreed to work together in a hub and spoke arrangement where we will share those priority questions. We'll share the data in a common portal. We'll publish and share the protocols, and we'll collect and share the data that we collect when we do reviews. And in that way, we will reduce waste, reduce duplication, share really, really scarce resources, bring the power of all of those methodologies together. And the 4 areas that have been flagged in the first instance are 2 health-related topics: infectious diseases, post-COVID, mental health. Wellcome are leading the charge on that. Climate action and education. So it's really a call out to say, if anybody in the audience has any questions, wants to connect to that, I'm very happy to broker the team for the day connection into that. And finally, we are going to, with that infectious disease hub and spoke mechanism, it allows us, we talked about motivation, capability, we have it in Ireland, to contribute, not just to take from this initiative, but also opportunity, you mentioned, John. And I suppose the opportunity, if you can call it that, in the COVID review, in discussing with our Chief Medical Officer, we have long talked about having an ever warm structure around evidence synthesis, at least, not just in this area, to be able to stand up rapid products, contextualized evidence, sharing with other global actors, that we will be able to stand up evidence in a matter of days, not months. And not years. So again, if anybody is interested in that and wants to hear more about our interaction, particularly with the Department of Health and the piece of work we've done similar to the TSI work, thanks to the Department of Health opening up their doors and their policy makers, you can see the protocol for an evidence support system assessment there. The findings of that will be presented for the first time at this national conference on the 3rd of December. There are places left. Love to have all of you. It'd be a good complaint if we're oversubscribed. And similarly, on that evidence synthesis infrastructure collaborative, where local meets global, and we start to work in an evidence ecosystem in that way, very happy to chat to anybody about that, and leave you with the point that a research system is critical to this endeavour. But we need more. Relationships and brokerage are critical, but we need more. And our learning in the Health Research Board over the years is that we have done a lot of work at connecting individual researchers and even academic institutions. We need the next step now. Loved your map, John. Love to get stuck into that, around connecting organisations, actors, communities, and having communities of communities. It's not easy, and really looking forward to working with this group, because we all need to work together to achieve that. So thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Your enthusiasm abounds, and we're all looking forward to the conference in December. And hopefully it'll be a bigger room than this. I'm sure it is. So we're going to move on now with Dr. Inez Bailey, the CEO of the Centre for Effective Services.
Checking, am I moving on my own slides here? Fantastic. Lovely to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I am here talking about the Centre for Effective Services, which many of you have maybe never heard about. And hopefully that's because we were an organisation set up in 2008 with a philanthropic grant under Atlantic Philanthropies to put a focus on evidence at a time in the development of policy for children. So we had a very, very specific purpose being established at that time. And it was a challenging context, I think, to say, look, we're going to set up a separate organisation to partner with government just to put a focus on evidence-informed policy and practice at a moment in time in Ireland's development. And the organisation has survived and sustained itself since then and widened out its remit in the context of broader social areas, which are denoted there in the slide. So essentially what we do is we work with either government departments, state agencies, or not-for-profits indeed, and universities in a partnership endeavour towards a particular purpose that's going to make life better for somebody or a group of people, whether that's through services or through some policy development. And we do that often in various different stages of the policy cycle, is a good way of thinking about it. So, for example, we are a recipient of funding from the HRB, where we are doing evidence synthesis around the whole area of breastfeeding, which hopefully will be quite useful in the context of the development of a current or a new breastfeeding strategy by the Department of Health. There's one example. We're also working in the area of implementation support. So effectively, where an organisation, let's take HSE, have been charged with the rolling out of the new sharing the vision strategy. So we're working very closely with them as we evolve towards a more sophisticated and an ever increasing service around mental health for children and adults. And then finally, a lot of the work that we end up doing is around the evaluation side. So often people will come to us and say, we want to get an independent evaluation of a particular initiative that we have been implementing, maybe on a pilot basis or over a longer period of time, with the view to determining whether or not it needs to be changed, stopped, which is rare, admittedly, or indeed we can use that evidence to lobby for additional funding for it to be perhaps brought to a wider audience. So our interface is ordinarily informed by whoever comes to us looking for our particular set of expertise to join them in some sort of an endeavour, whether that is a university looking for research funding or whether it is a government department who puts out something for through procurement, which we apply for, sometimes with partners in research organisations to do that work. We are all island because we were set up on that basis at the time. We have an office in Belfast as well as in Dublin. And we think we're unique. So that's a challenge. Maybe there might be lots of people here who think they're unique too. But we think we're unique in the context because we have that all island basis and because we are a charity as well. So I'd love to know if there were anybody else doing that on the island of Ireland. Our service offer, I suppose, depends, as I say, on what partners are really looking for us to do with them. So we've just used that kind of circle to give effect to the policy cycle in terms of showing what that looks like in reality. So government departments do not come out and say, we are looking for evidence for X. There's usually a much more contextualized requirement. There's usually a very specific deadline, and there's usually, I suppose, a set of factors that also have to be taken into account. So when we apply to do work, we meet those criteria. And that can sometimes be, I think, a challenge, depending on the type of organisation you are. But for us, that is actually our bread and butter in terms of trying to supply what we do to the actual demands of the system at a moment in time. A lot of our work is really messy, very complicated and complex, and it doesn't often lend itself to a huge amount of time and consideration. But what we hope to do, I suppose, when we do that kind of work is we do, because we're not for profit, we bring the learning from everything we do into the next piece of work. So we don't necessarily talk about who gave us the learning or where we drew it from, but we're able to say, that the work that we did in an environment where they were looking at, let's say, the development of an outcomes framework, instead of saying, oh yeah, and we know how to do outcomes frameworks, give us loads of money to do that, we can essentially say, there are lots of other organisations across the system looking at outcomes frameworks. We can point them to the ones that are already there, maybe give some guidance around how to use them. And if there's more support needed, then we can do that. But we're intimately, I suppose, aware of a lot of things that are happening in that kind of social scene, whether it's in housing, homelessness, health, education, and justice. There's a huge amount of evaluation material in particular that is produced. There's often kind of, I suppose, in the research community, maybe seen as grey-ish, but it does provide a huge amount of evidence that's being gathered on initiatives across the system with a lot of recommendations, often geared towards policymakers, but which also would be very useful for other people working in those research areas. So maybe just to finish on one, we were commissioned by the Department of Children to do an evaluation of 3 equality strategies. And the remit was very clear. We were not asked to evaluate the content of those 3 strategies because the department felt that they were inundated with information about what may or may not go into the content. Where they were really struggling was trying to understand what were the barriers to the implementation of those 3 strategies over a specific period of time. So it was a very interesting piece of work to evaluate that initiative and to give that back to the department as they commenced into a process of the development of the next iteration of those 3 equality strategies. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The final speaker in this group is Dr. Claire Hickey, the Head of Socioeconomic Research at the Parliamentary Research Office.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Parliamentary Research Service, and I'm probably going to talk really fast, so apologies in advance. So just to get started, the PRS was established in 2006. We currently have 20 senior researchers organised into 5 subject teams. We have lawyers, social scientists, economists, agriculture and environmental scientists, and political scientists. And together with my colleague, we manage the service. So we're responsible for delivering expert, impartial, reliable and accessible research to support the work of both houses, that's the Dáil and the Seanad, committees and individual members in respect of their parliamentary duties. So we primarily do secondary research, and our work can be divided into 3 broad types, which I'm just going to show some examples on the slide. So the first type, it's probably very hard to read there, but the first type of research is our legislative analysis work, and that's intended to inform members' scrutiny of proposed legislation. So we prepare on request pre-legislative scrutiny papers for government bills and private members' bills, and we also provide policy and legislative briefing papers and analysis of published bills for all good government legislation moving through the houses. So you can't really see them, but the ones with the green branding are publicly available papers that anybody can access. The others papers become the property of the committee. The second type of research that we do in our team is a bespoke commissioned, what we call commissioned research for individual members and committees. And these papers can be used by individual members and committees to inform their policy development work. Our work for members is confidential, but I've included a couple of examples on the slide of committee requested papers, and also some of our proactive. That's where we try and get ahead of issues and we publish ahead of maybe the legislative agenda or ahead of the policy agenda. So there's some examples on the slide there. And then the final area that we provide research on is to our colleagues in parliamentary services. And that's really to help them in their procedural and operational work. So, for example, research to support the work of the Committee on Standing Orders and Law Reform, for example. So that's a little bit about what we do and who we are. And I suppose I just wanted to set the context for the use of evidence in Parliament more generally, and then maybe to say something about how we in the Parliamentary Research Service use evidence. So in my experience, research and evidence are more broadly understood within the parliamentary community. So, you know, in the academic community, I guess rigorous systematic research is the order of the day. Within the parliamentary community, members really are interested in practical, tacit, empirical and theoretical, a little bit like what Barry was saying this morning. Members draw on research and information from a whole range of different sources. And the quality and reliability of those sources can be, vary significantly. So there's also, I think, in terms of how Parliament uses research, I think there's a mixed understanding of the role of Parliament among the research community and how research can be used by Parliament. So some academic research by researchers in the UK in 2018 showed that NGOs and civil society groups are generally much better at getting their research in front of members and committees. And given their advocacy role, these groups have a good understanding of the legislative and policy cycle, and they make their research accessible to the parliamentary community. So in contrast, I think the scale, scope and methodological rigour of academic research can often mean the studies can take a long time to complete, leading to a mismatch between the policy legislative cycle and the research cycle. So in addition, and although it may not always seem like it, Parliament can move pretty fast when it needs to. So for example, committees have about 8 weeks to conduct pre-legislative scrutiny on government bills, really tight time frame for us to deliver any sort of research paper to the committee for their consideration. It also means that there's really tight timelines for submissions to be made to committees and for stakeholders to be invited to present to committees to discuss either policy, legislation in the 8 weeks piece. Also, members often, so I manage what's called the Legislative Analysis Service, and we and members often only find out what legislation is scheduled for second stage debate, and that's plenary debate. The week before it's coming up, and the bill often only gets published a few days before it's taken for second stage. So it's a really tight turnaround for not only us as PRS, but also members to get to grips with the issues at play in a piece of legislation. So I suppose, what does this mean for us in the PRS? Well, we have to take research in its broadest form. It's our role to assess the veracity of available research as best we can and to provide an independent analysis. We have to be impartial, and so to take an independent analysis of what the broad body of literature is saying about a particular topic or issue. Our research papers present the evidence for and against. That isn't to say that all claims are treated equally. We obviously need to look at methodology and rigour, but we do need to consider and assess them, because you'll be sure that the members will be aware of both the for and against. Our work is a bit different maybe to some in the room, insofar as we don't make calls to actions in our paper. We don't make recommendations, and we don't advocate for political policies to be advanced in our papers. Rather, we use the research evidence available to us to analyse the issues and share that analysis with the members in a timely and hopefully accessible way. As I'm sure you can imagine, it's challenging. It's made more so, I think, by the range of information that's available, research and information. We have to rely on our research skills. We do have robust QA processes, but being attuned to and being able to identify mis and disinformation is really important in our role. So I've given a couple of examples around the timeframes that we already work to. So for PRS, while we have to rely on our research skills, obviously, to do the work, and we haven't really changed the way that we use our evidence. What we have had to change is some of our outputs, some of the way we write. So we're making much greater use of shorter executive summaries, greater use of infographics, blog posts. So really trying to think about the time per member and what they can engage with in terms of our research outputs. And then the final thing I just wanted to highlight, I suppose, is that we can work on anything. A legal researcher could be writing about planning and development legislation one week, and the following week they could be writing about the AI Act coming, or looking at transposition from Europe. So they have to cover, while we're grouped in subject areas, it's a broad understanding of that particular subject area. So keeping on top of the research and information that's out there is really, really challenging. And while individual researchers do develop relationships with individual academic researchers, we have over the last little while been trying to develop our relationships with academic institutions at a more systemic level. So I'm really thrilled to be here and to hopefully get a chance to meet and talk with some of you about the work that we do and maybe how we can utilise and engage with the academic community a little bit more. So I'll leave it there, and happy to answer any questions. Thanks very much.
Well done, Claire. And just a big thanks to all 5 of our speakers. For the next. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. who is Sarah Chater. She's the Director of Research Strategy and Policy at UCL and the co-chair of the UK University Policy Engagement Network, known as UPEN. She is a real thinker, innovator and doer in this area in the university sector and connecting into government. And it's a real privilege that you've agreed to join us today as part of your Irish tour. But we are really thrilled, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you today and to the engagement afterwards.
Thank you. You've really taught me up. I hope I don't disappoint. And I should say, in seriousness, really, thank you very much for inviting me, because it's given me a real opportunity to come and talk to people and understand more about the Irish ecosystem, which is just fascinating. So I'm definitely getting more out of this, just in case you're in doubt. So what I wanted to do today was to reflect on some experiences from the UK in strengthening connections between academic research and public policy making. You might read this title as a little discouraging, and this is definitely an agenda that has been decades in the making. But given we're in MoLI with Ulysses upstairs, I would also remind you that, as Leopold Bloom told us, sometimes longest way round is shortest way home. So that is your mantra for today. And what I want to argue is that universities play a critical role in enabling research policy engagement, but that if we want to do that effectively, then we do need to work a bit differently. So universities, certainly in the UK, and you can tell me if this is true in Ireland, are traditionally pretty good at trumpeting their achievements, at operating in show-off mode. But as you can see in any school playground, showing off isn't always the best way to make friends. And it's making friends, building, maintaining relationships, developing trust that's at the heart of effective research policy engagement. So what we have to constantly remember as universities, certainly in the UK, is that this isn't about institutional glory. It's not about winning an engagement race. It's not about celebrating individual academic stars or lone wolves. And it's not about securing fancy photo opportunities. What I think it's really about is the hard slog of building connections and trust, of listening, which we often forget to do, of providing insight, and really importantly, of creating new processes and structures to make better use of academic evidence in policy making. So that's what I mean when I talk about academic policy engagement, those structures, those processes. And it's not glamorous work necessarily. It's very rarely quick or easy. And it's also not work that we're really very well set up to do as universities. I think it also requires us to think a lot less about competition and much more about cooperation with each other. And we heard that from Trina and David this morning, the importance of coming together around this agenda. Because to be really effective, I think this does need to be a collective endeavour. So that's the kind of the university health warning out of the way. And what I want to do now is just briefly reflect on some of the context that I think is now behind the research policy ecosystem in the UK. And it's starting with the question of why the role of universities in this is so important. So this is Solly Zuckerman, who I'm sure many of you recognise. I had no idea what he looked like until I Googled him. He was appointed as the first UK government chief scientific advisor in 1964, but that followed about 20 years of providing scientific advice to the UK government under different guises, and most notably in the Second World War. So we can see that formal recognition of the need for scientific advice in policy making has been around in the UK for at least 60 years, and it's been around informally for some time before that. But it's been primarily conceived of in terms of individual scientists or experts offering their wisdom, which is encapsulated in this rather lavish testimonial from Margaret Thatcher, somebody I never actually thought I would use in a presentation. It's a risky move. But she says something nice here. It's only much more recently, I think, though, that we've started to think not only about this individual role of academics, but about the institutional role of universities. So that's really what I want to focus on today. And I think we've seen a recent recognition, growing recognition of this role of universities, partly as a response to growing attempts within the UK policy system in both government and parliament to promote the use of evidence, and partly as a response to funder incentives investments. So this timeline here captures some of those developments, quick plug, you can see a fuller and more interactive timeline on UPenn's website for anybody who's really interested. But I would really highlight the formation of the Government Office for Science in 2007, which really kind of kick-started this agenda in government, and the publication the next year by the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology on strengthening academic engagement with government. We also had the introduction of the Research Excellence Framework in 2014, which focused attention much more on the societal impact of research, which included its impact on policy. And more recently, we've had the development of government department areas of research interest. So these are sort of statements of evidence need, which are now collected into a searchable database. And then over the past 5 years or so, we've had a number of different funder investments in academic policy engagement initiatives, which have been focused both on national levels of policy making, but also the subnational level, which is becoming much more important in a UK context. And my back of the envelope calculation is that we've seen at least £100 million now invested specifically in research policy engagement initiatives in that time, which is a decent driver. But I think there is something else going on as well. I'll come back a bit later to what more I think universities need to do to strengthen this role in the research policy ecosystem. But what I want to reflect on now are some of the insights from the work that I and colleagues in the UK have been doing over the past 10 years or so in response to this developing academic policy engagement agenda. So what we have, so look, it's another ecosystem map. What we have at the moment in the UK is a really complex, I think, and still evolving research policy ecosystem. So this is a very first attempt to map this. It's available on the UPenn website, but it's a work in progress. Lots is missing. I think the point here really is that there are multiple components and nodes which comprise inputs from policymakers, from funders, from academic institutions, and from many others. So represented here are structures and initiatives to engage with academic evidence at all levels of government and in all legislatures. There's a growing number of intermediary organisations and of dedicated policy engagement units in universities. And then we have UPenn, and we're trying to work across and between the different components of this ecosystem. I think the problem, which is something John was alluding to earlier, and David mentioned, is that navigating this from whatever position you're in can feel a little bit as if you're working on your first night in as a mixologist in a cocktail bar. You've got no menu. So everyone's asked you for a different drink. There's no recipes. You're not even sure where the ingredients are. You don't know which drinks are easiest to make. You don't know which are going to get you the biggest tips. And you don't know which recipes will stand the test of time. So I think there's a fundamental challenge for us in thinking, how do we develop our cocktail menu? Or in other words, to better navigate this ecosystem. And so I think one very powerful approach is to work much more collaboratively, to support more connections and coordination across that ecosystem. So when I first started working in this space, I did it from the perspective of a single institution, which was UCL, thinking about how to build our institutional ability to engage with public policy. UCL has a lot of credibility with policymakers, and we have a strategic advantage because of our London location. But I became increasingly aware that however effective we were as UCL, policymakers could be wary of engagement with a single university. And also that actually they don't necessarily care if it's UCL research or somebody else's research. They just want the evidence and the insights that can help them to tackle the problems they're facing at that particular moment. So this realisation was one of the key drivers in establishing the Capabilities in Academic Policy Engagement, or CAPE project. So that's what I want to just spend a bit of time on now. I'm sorry, I've got a bit of a frog in my throat, so I'll do that occasionally. CAPE was established to develop our understanding of different mechanisms for academic policy engagement, working in different institutional contexts, in different geographical locations around the UK, and at different levels of government. And it was the first project funded by UK Research and Innovation, which was about testing those mechanisms and trying to provide a structural intervention by working at a national scale to bring several universities together to act as a consortium. So we were working collaboratively to build policy engagement activities and partnerships, to provide a single interface for policymakers and a shared team resource across the 5 universities. Over 4 years, that enabled us to work with 60 different policy partners and to engage with hundreds more academics and other policy actors. We delivered policy fellowships, more than 70. We delivered co-produced seed-funded projects, about 30 of those, more than 90 knowledge exchange events, and 10 toolkits on different sort of how-to aspects of academic policy engagement. And then lots of other activities and outputs around that, reports and videos and podcasts and case studies. But the key point for me is that every activity was developed in collaboration with our policy partners and with each other. And that meant a lot of our time was spent on building relationships, on establishing trust, and on co-design and co-delivery, which is a lot easier to say than to actually do, I think. And working in that way also enabled us to work on more strategic partnerships. So we embedded regional policy fellows with combined authorities at the regional level to strengthen structures and capacity for evidence use in West Yorkshire, in London, in the North East, and we worked with Nottingham City Council to develop an expert advisory group there. We piloted the use of those areas of research interest I mentioned with select committees in both the UK Parliament and the Welsh Senedd. And we developed a multi-year partnership with one government department, which enabled us to experiment together to run a whole series of different engagement activities to support evidence use in multiple policy areas across the department. So after doing all that, what did we learn? So this is a distillation of our key insights. You can read more in our final report, but if you don't want to do that, then what I would highlight is firstly, the fundamental importance of a policy demand-led approach, because that ensured that what we were doing all the time was directly addressing policy need. But secondly, the value of embedding sufficient flexibility and time to support that demand-led approach. You can't just do it. You can't just drop everything and suddenly magically have a thing that meets policy demand. So we needed to put a lot of time in understanding demand, in working to sort of figure out what we could do to address it, and then delivering whatever that was. And we also needed the time to build the long-term relationships and the trust that's so important to this work, which is something we've already heard a lot about today. But then thirdly, which is what I really want to emphasise, I think, for the purposes of today's discussion, is that working as a collaborative partnership was a direct enabler of this academic policy engagement, because it really opened doors for us with national government and with Parliament. It enabled us to build lasting organisational relationships, so relationships that went beyond individual interactions and specific projects. And we had quite a lot of officials who would tell us that they could work with CAPE as a consortium in a way they couldn't have worked with UCL or any other university as a single institution. But it also supported that demand-led approach because we had this wider pool of people and expertise to call on. And in a very practical sense, it meant we had more capacity and we could pass the baton amongst the team when we needed to. And as you all know, when you're juggling a million things at once, sometimes it's really nice to be able to pass the baton. So as we learned more about embedding collaboration and the multiple benefits that accrued from it, we also learnt more that it took considerable resource in terms of people and time. And therefore, that what we really needed to focus on was building the underpinning capacity to deliver sustainable engagement, so engagement beyond one-off activities. In other words, what we learnt about was the work of knowledge mobilisation, which I'll come back to in a little bit. And then as CAPE came to an end, we worked with UPenn to hand over our key relationships. That was really important to kind of have that continuity. We transferred our toolkits and our other resources, and we're continuing some programmes of work via UPenn, such as the areas of research interest work, which we're now developing with different public bodies, and a university government pairing scheme, which I promise, David, is more considered than throwing academics into government and leaving them to sink or swim. But that brings me neatly to why I think UPenn is so important for the UK research policy ecosystem. So UPenn was established as a voluntary network about 7 years ago by a very small number of universities meeting in a room at UCL. And we'd all been talking about how we could work together a bit more as we sought to increase our research engagement with public policy. And this still felt like quite a new enterprise at the time. I think most of us felt we were making it up as we went along, or learning by doing in a more technical phrase. We've now grown as UPenn to more than 120 members across the UK, working together in a network, which is everybody in that network is really committed to strengthening the use of academic evidence in policymaking. And I think there were two key drivers for that initial founding, but also for the way that we've grown, which is firstly the very clear demand that we see in the UK from policymakers for a streamlined interface with academia. So they don't have to approach multiple different universities or academics every time they want to draw on research evidence, or every time they want to kind of reach out and understand who they might talk to. But secondly, it was a mutual effort to support each other as we all learn more about this new space we're working in. And that's been a really important part of what UPenn does. Our most loved service is pretty simple. It's a regular curation of engagement opportunities and evidence requests from policymakers, which goes out through our newsletter, the UPenn Update. And we also deliver other activities which range from convening and workshops to practical support and resources. And this has all been sort of developed as we've developed the network, as we try to strengthen the role of UPenn as an interface with the public policy system. We're now highlighted in government guidance for civil servants on engaging with academics, and we're fielding about 200 policy engagement opportunities and evidence requests a year. So we can see there's a lot of demand in the system. But for most of our existence, we functioned as a voluntary network. This activity was all being powered by goodwill and enthusiasm of our members and of people who really felt strongly about UPenn. We had a very small operating budget and a part-time network manager. But the good news is that last year we secured funding from UK Research and Innovation, which is really aimed at helping us to develop UPenn into a sustainable organisation to connect academia and public policy across this wider research policy ecosystem. So our ambition is to enhance UPenn's ability to draw on research knowledge from universities right across the UK to inform public policy making. And that's really important because there is a usual suspects problem in the UK. That's about people, but it's also about institutions like mine that sit within the golden triangle and are sort of the default mode. So how do we get beyond that? How do we have a greater diversity at universities and of individuals? And also, how do we develop UPenn's ability to provide a more proactive brokerage capacity? So we're working with and through our network to respond to policy needs at all levels of government. And then alongside all that, how do we make ourselves a sustainable organisation with a sustainable operating model? So that's what we're currently focusing on. But as we do this work, I think we mustn't lose sight of a really fundamental question, certainly for the UK, as universities are feeling a financial squeeze. Which is, why should anyone care about this? Why does it matter? Why is it something that universities should be thinking about? This is very rarely at the top of Vice-Chancellors' to-do lists. So it's a bit of a cliche now to talk about the poly crisis, or what Gordon Brown and his co-authors have called a perma-crisis, but I don't think that makes it any less relevant or important. We know that policymakers, and indeed all of us, are increasingly grappling with these complex and systemic and interconnected problems, and in large part, we don't really know what to do about them. So if we're going to be tackling these massive and often intractable issues, then I think we need better policy making and we need different approaches. We can't do it by working in the same old ways, especially when, in the UK at least, the policy making system itself is under huge pressure and quite considerable financial constraint. This is not problems that we can throw money at. So I think making better use of academic evidence and expertise is one way to strengthen policy making, and that as universities, we need to recognise that as an imperative for our role. We're institutions of knowledge, so we need to make sure that that knowledge is contributing to trying to tackle some of these issues, to work with policy. And we can't take it for granted, I think, anymore, that we command widespread public support. Our values increasingly being questioned, and I think we have very chilling evidence from the other side of the Atlantic as to what can happen if universities can't demonstrate our social value to all citizens. I don't think anybody in the US can pretend that we didn't know this was coming. This speech, was 2021, and it set out an agenda, and that agenda is now being implemented. I think we need to take that very seriously, not by being defensive, but by being proactive in how we respond. So I take inspiration from two philosophers to think about how we can better purpose knowledge to address societal needs. The utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham is often referred to as the spiritual founder of UCL, and he used the Greek term chrestomathia, which is lovely and easy to say, even easier than Gaelic, to denote useful learning in his writings on education. So I think universities need to be thinking much more about useful knowledge, the actions that we need to take to ensure that wider society benefits as much as possible and as many ways as possible from the knowledge which we produce, so they can feel those practical effects that Bentham talked about. But that also, I've skipped forward. Let you get a sneak preview now. That also requires some sense of working with and not doing to society. So John Dewey, the American philosopher, was one of the proponents of pragmatism, which is the idea that knowledge and inquiry should be focused on problem solving and action rather than simply description and analysis. So that means rejecting what he called a spectator theory of knowledge and seeing knowledge very much as focused on improving society. I still can't do it, sorry. Universities are already doing some of this, but I don't think we've really embedded this core idea as a key function of what we do. And we need to be really wary of the risk that Dewey emphasised, which is that if we are shut off from knowledge of the very societal problems that we're trying to address, we become irrelevant. I think we're neglecting at the moment the full breadth of the ways in which we can make this societal contribution. And perhaps that's because we've been too focused on making arguments about our economic contributions. But if that's all we focus on, then we're failing to make the most of our knowledge base and we're failing to make the most of public investment in research. And that means we don't have a good answer to those taxpayers who are investing in it. This is why I am worried that we've not embraced academic policy engagement as a key mission for universities. Even where we do think about it, it's seen as a nice to have, as an add-on, something we do when we get round to it, somebody else's problem, somebody else's job, which is what John said earlier. It's not seen as part of our business as usual activity. So I think it is a missing mission and we need to make it much more of a priority. I can see a few nods, which is great. But even if you agree it's necessary, it's not enough. We need to understand how to better enable it. And that's the how that David was talking about this morning. So I think that requires paying much more attention to this invisible infrastructure, which provides the connective capacity that we need for sustainable research policy engagement. And I call it invisible because a lot of it is overlooked or hidden work. It's not really recognised as a practice. It's not really celebrated within universities. So what you can see here on the slide is a mapping of the invisible mycelium network. This is the underground network that fungus create, and it's critical to our natural ecosystem because it's what enables trees and other plants to communicate with each other in something called the Wood Wide Web, apparently. Yeah. But in universities and actually in policy organisations as well, in other organisations in this space, there's a similar invisible but critical infrastructure which is supporting institutional capacity for academic policy engagement. So that's the people who do the work in building and maintaining relationships, in identifying and responding to opportunities, in finding expertise, in convening different actors. And it's the structures and the processes that support the interactions and evidence use in policy making that we all want to see. But I think this is hidden work. This is knowledge mobilisation. It underpins the research policy interface. It's what enables that ecosystem that we've been talking about today and goes beyond just a small number of interactions between a small number of individuals. It's really easy to overlook, but I think if we continue to do that, then we are neglecting the foundations of a research policy ecosystem. And like a building built on inadequate foundations, we may ultimately risk its collapse. I think we need to pay much more attention to this vital underpinning infrastructure. Sticking with my building theme, it's utterly critical, in my view, to the ability of universities to systematically enable engagement between academic research and policy making. So I think we need to think along the lines of the Pompidou Centre. So the architecture of this building, which is lovely, I'm sure many of you have seen it, is that you can see all of the infrastructure, not just the pretty bits, but all the parts of the building that are normally kept hidden, but are fundamental to making it work. So that's your second mantra. Supporting this infrastructural capacity matters, not just because it's a nice thing to do, because I think it's what helps us think seriously about how we address some really persistent challenges for connecting research to policy. So that's what I want to consider before I finish. Now, these obviously come from my experience working in the UK, but I think at least some of them apply more widely, and I'll be really interested to hear what you think. And indeed, if you've got any of them sussed, then please let me know. But firstly, we're working in a constantly changing landscape. As you all know, public policy moves fast. The former UK Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, much happier quoting him, is frequently quoted as having said, "A week is a long time in politics." And so we know policy priorities change rapidly. And of course, research knowledge isn't static, but it does move at a different pace. So that means we need constant iteration between the policy demand and the academic evidence supply, which is essential so that we can ensure mutual understanding, and so that research knowledge can both meaningfully address policy needs, can inform public policy making, and I think where appropriate, be informed by it in turn and understand what those needs are. And that only really happens, I think, through sustained and long-term relationships and structures. But, which is my second challenge, most academic policy engagement is not sustainable. So how can we ensure that engagement activities and relationships can survive the end of project funding or changes in circumstances? In other words, how do we shift from a transactional approach to one of partnership? Well, I think that requires resilience and a long-term rather than a fleeting commitment, which is where the coelacanth fish comes in, which I know you've been wondering about. So this fish has been around for about 400 million years and counting. Still there, survived the end of the dinosaurs. And it's an inspiration for me because we can't affect the systems change that I think we need to unless we recognise that this is a long-term endeavour. Hopefully not a 400 million year endeavour. And then thirdly, working in a complex, rapidly changing, often very ambiguous environment means the nature of this work is a constant effort to weave together different motivations, different interests, different inputs, different perspectives to try to identify shared agendas and common purpose. Now, ideally, like the goddess Athena, who was a master weaver, this weaving together of many different threads can produce a beautiful policy design. However, it can also often, I think, feel more like the mortal Penelope, who wove by day, then unwove by night, and rewove the next day. So it's a constant endeavour of making and remaking, doing and redoing. And that is exhausting, and it's also very hard to know when you're finished, because perhaps you never have. I think we also need to be thinking much more actively about the role of universities as cross-system conveners and integrators of knowledge. So as in the parable of the blind men, who are each feeling a particular part of the elephant, but they're not able to see the whole of it, we need to get away from that and think about the role of universities in enabling more systemic and more holistic acting with other actors to address those policy crisis challenges, which I mentioned earlier. And sticking with the elephant theme, with this lovely little cheery one in mosaics, we need to move to more of what I've heard called an evidence mosaics approach. So this is the idea that integrating evidence from different academic disciplines, different forms of expertise, different parts of society, business, civil society, policy actors, practitioners, community groups, experts by experience, and so on, is what gives us a really rigorous and feasible evidence base. So tackling complex policy challenges means we need to think about how we integrate these different evidence inputs. And that's about supporting a holistic understanding of the problem, but it's also about understanding and having a holistic approach to tackling that problem, holistic action. And finally, and perhaps sort of most mission critically at the moment, there's no operating model for academic policy engagement in the UK. I think rather what we have is an operating kaleidoscope. And that requires a willingness to keep churning the kaleidoscope to change the picture so we can find the kind of the levers and incentives that exist in a given moment to support the activity we want to do. So at different times, there might be something coming from the public policy system, there might be a research funder driver, there might be a push from universities. But these aren't fixed, they keep changing, and we need to keep adjusting the kaleidoscope. And that makes long-term planning difficult. I think policymakers, universities and funders all now need to work together to think about what a more sustainable and stable operating model for academic policy engagement could look like. And I don't think this is impossible. It's been done, for example, for university business engagement. So 20 years ago, when I first started working on research policy, there was lots of concern about the lack of university business engagement, lots of policy intention on how to incentivise it. And now what we have is a flourishing university business ecosystem. There are policy incentives, there are established funding programmes in place, and they're there to support engagement and to provide capacity. So I think what we need to do is find the equivalent interventions and joint shared actions for our research policy ecosystem. Now, these are all, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, really difficult challenges, and they won't be solved overnight. But we do need to meet them, I think, if we want a sustainable and effective research policy ecosystem for the long term, by which I mean one where researchers and policymakers can work together and with other actors to ensure that public policy is informed by research evidence and insights and is robust as it can be, so that it's then ultimately delivering better outcomes for people. So what might that look like? So I'm trying not to oversimplify this, but I think it does really come down to these 3 C's: capacity, connections, collaboration. We need sufficient capacity in both academic and policy organisations to ensure that we can make the time and space for engagement that we've heard about, and to recognise that it can be long-term in nature and long-term in payoff. Creating capacity also requires us to build the necessary capabilities to do this work. And for me, that comes down above all to investing in and building capacity for knowledge mobilisation. In practical terms, then, that's about skills development, it's about mentoring, it's about workload recognition, it's about better career pathways for people who undertake knowledge mobilisation, whether they're in a policy or an academic or a professional role. And capacity is also crucial to sustain partnerships beyond specific interactions or particular activities, which takes me to my next C, connections, not the next slide. Supporting evidence use in policymaking, I think, relies on a plethora of connections right across the ecosystem. It's not about bilateral one-way relationships, as we've heard from John. It's about multilateral, multilinear connections between researchers, civil society, businesses, policy, public services, drawing together those different forms of expertise and insights so we better understand the challenges that we face and how they can be addressed. So that needs cross-system ways of working, and it also needs multi-level ways of working, not just at one level of government, so that we're working throughout the whole policy ecosystem. And I think that's only achieved by my final C, collaboration. If we want an effective and a better coordinated ecosystem, then we need much more collaboration between the different actors within it. And that means moving to a collaboration by default way of working that's at odds with a long established culture of competition, both within universities and in policy organisations in the UK. But I think it's only by taking that more collaborative approach that we can maximise the impact of the ecosystem to strengthen the use of evidence in policy making. And that's where my bees come in. These are honeybees. And in the ecosystem of the bee colony, each bee has a specific and essential role. All the bees work together in service of the colony in order to build their hive and to produce honey. So we need to be working together to create the honey that is evidence-informed policy. And of course, bees also play a vital role in the larger ecosystem because they make an essential contribution to biodiversity. So I draw a parallel here with the larger role that evidence-informed policy has in leading to better outcomes for society. But really what I'm trying to say is that we need to take a bee-like approach to our research policy ecosystem to support all of the elements required to make it work and to strengthen the connections across that ecosystem. Because when we talk about strengthening the research policy ecosystem, I think what we're really talking about is systems change, and we're not going to achieve that without collective action. So I'm going to finish by encouraging us all to heed these words of Gandhi, which I think really resonate with what David was emphasising this morning about the how as well. Of course, the ends matter. We want research to inform policy decisions so that we see benefits for people, whether that's improved public health or environmental sustainability or responsibly harnessing technology. But we cannot and must not neglect the means. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I think we could have listened to you all afternoon. The organised thinking and the ambition to make a difference and to pull people together, it was just astounding, and it's a great privilege for us that you're here meeting with us and sharing your thoughts and your views on the way forward. I think it's really, really, really interesting, and I'd nearly say a philosophy underpinning the approach was kind of evident in what you were saying. And I want to just this is supposed to be a fireside chat. We didn't have the courage to ask everybody to move and light the fire, so you're going to have to put up with the backdrop of the maybe rain that we have on the dull day, but it's easier just to stay put. And we don't have very long, and we'll try and open it up as we go along. I know we suggested some questions for you, but I love going off questions. I want to ask actually, your initial motivation to get interested in this area, because you talked about being in an initial role 20 years ago. Could you tell us a bit about that and how you sort of that bit at the start of this journey, and how you maybe got some colleagues who were interested to work with you and so on?
Sure. I mean, I think the initial role, this has been extremely, so I'm just going to be rude because it's 20 years ago. So I started my career actually working as a researcher for a number of MPs. And each of them, I just want to stress, were totally dedicated to making a difference into public service. But when you work in that parliamentary environment, and this was when our equivalent, the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, was just getting itself started. What I saw very quickly is that almost all of the policy making that goes on in Parliament, so the scrutinising of legislation and of government policy, is driven by knee-jerk instinctive reactions. And to some extent, I think that's fine. These are our democratically elected representatives. You know, they're elected Parliament on the basis of the values they hold. But there was no attempt to kind of objectively look at legislation that was coming forward and think about what the implications might be and whether there was any evidence. And then my last boss was actually a bit more of a nerd, and he did occasionally want to look at evidence, but it was very much, cherry picking. It was, what evidence can I find that will back up my position? So I think that just stuck with me. And when I moved into working in the university sector, it was just in the back of my head all the time. I actually had a role which required me to do a fair amount of cherry picking of evidence on research policy for a while, and it just never sat comfortably. And when I moved to UCL, it gave me the opportunity to think about what could this, big university, where it's very broad, very large, big university working in London do to better bring evidence into policy making. And I think maybe the final thing to emphasise is I was very fortunate to have a very supportive boss in the form of the Vice Provost Research then. So he allowed me to run with it. And what I had to do was find a coalition of the willing, which is something that my good friend and colleague Liz Shutt and I often talk about. It's really important that not everybody is up for this, and that's fine. Some people who think they're up for it have very definitive ideas about it that are less fine. So finding that coalition and starting to build this idea that it was something that mattered, that actually it was something universities should do, was really what drove me, I suppose. And then the backdrop for that was the impact agenda in the UK, people thinking about, well, how do I demonstrate my research? That gave me a bit, I guess, of cover, of operating cover. But I think the final thing I'll say before I shut up is there was no grand plan, right? This was me feeling my way. It really was making up a lot of it as I went along and slowly realising that there was a small group of people who were up for it too. And then as there was greater awareness, I guess, in the UK policy making system of the need for evidence, that was something the Blair government really kind of charged. Then we started to see that there was actually demand and appetite and something for us to work with. So it was a bit push-pull.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to keep going with your story if you don't mind. So I think there's a lot of people in this room who are building up coalitions or beginning to build up coalitions. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how you went about that, whether it was within the university and with other universities and into the policymaking system?
That's a good question. So it definitely started within the university because I was just trying to work out what on earth we should do. And I think I was fortunate to find a couple of academics that just instinctively got this. And also fortunate that we recruited, UCL had recruited a former chief scientific advisor to a government department, and then somebody who had worked deep in what was, oh God, I can't remember what it's called then, our department that looks after science at the time. And having the two of them as kind of, as a triumvirate of people who got this and were willing to basically open their address book and share a bit of their greater strategic experience, I suppose, really made a difference. So that was the first coalition. I think the next coalition was starting to work with any academic colleague I could find and any professional services colleague I could find who remotely thought this was interesting. And after 2 or 3 years, we'd started, I think, to establish UCL as and it was early then, universities didn't really talk about this. So we'd started to establish UCL in this space. And then other people started to emerge. So there was the Cambridge Centre for Science and Policy, had lots of early days conversations with their first director and their second director. They were both really crucial, I think, in making me realise, there was a bit more to this. And then some other universities, Southampton, Durham, so across the UK started to look at this agenda. And we all wanted to talk to each other because we were all learning as we were going. So having that peer support network is probably what really initially drove the coalition. And then the realisation that we were all having these individual conversations with the officials we happen to know in government. And they were basically all saying, this is all great, but, can you just get your act together? Can you join up what you're doing? We don't want to keep having these individual conversations. So there was a real demand for that at that kind of, it wasn't a grand government strategy. It was at the mid-career officials, the doers, I think of them in government. The people in government who were the doers were saying, please make this easier for us. And when you've got that just gave me the confidence, I think, to say, right, we've got to take that seriously. We've got to respond. And that was what gave rise to UPenn. And then we were fortunate as UPenn to build a network and have a number, there are 3 predecessor chairs of UPenn before me, and they have all helped to build the network, to build that kind of broader coalition, and I think to build greater awareness in both government and with our research funders that this work mattered and there was something in it. So it's a team, collective, multi-person endeavour.
So going to talk about the challenges of building up then those coalitions. I suppose, how open were people to become fellow travellers? Where you obviously found loads over time. Did you find others who said, that's grand, I don't want to be involved? And did you find others who actively maybe acted against you? I might talk a bit about that.
Yeah, that's another very good question. So I think I can say this because it's long enough ago. It was really quite hard work getting some of the UCL academic community on board with the idea of U10, because there was a predominant attitude, I think, that we're already quite good at this, we're well placed to do this, why would we join forces with other people? So that was a long and painful conversation at times. We should not pretend that. And there are probably still many academics who are quite happy, you know, like ploughing their own furrow, doing it really well, who don't necessarily buy into the idea of doing this collectively. I mean, I think that's fine, as long as there's not active undermining of the kind you're saying. I think there is a strange dynamic in the UK, I think. There's this kind of push-pull between intense competition for students, for research funding, for kind of reputational prestige, and that's quite hard to navigate and negotiate. And I think it's kind of hard to articulate this as well, but I think it probably helps that I was in a big institution with broad shoulders, because it meant that we could maybe take on some of the burden along with some of our partners to kind of get this off the ground. But it meant we had to really work hard to demonstrate that this wasn't like a big UCL takeover, you know, that we were trying to act genuinely in partnership and to be collaborative. So the more we were able to do practical things, to do convening on behalf of a larger group, that really helped. But yeah, it's definitely not been straightforward. And I think as we see more pressures in the sector, I worry a little bit that we're going to see some of that competitive instinct that perhaps we've sort of smoothed over a bit come more to the fore. So that's something to watch.
And coming to the modern day and UPenn itself, you put an interesting map up of these islands, and obviously the 120, I think, universities in the UK. There's a lot more than 120 universities. So how are they seeking to engage with you, or are they just doing their own thing, or how does that work? The ones that aren't involved yet?
It varies. So we are still kind of getting 2 or 3 inquiries about membership every month, I would say. So there are about 140 something publicly funded institutions in the UK, and that's really probably what we're talking about. So about a year ago, there was just this steady, it was almost a new member every week. We couldn't keep up, and that's slowed a little bit. But one of our ambitions by the end of our current UKRI funding is to get every publicly funded university member. I think a lot of it is we are. I probably made us. Well, I hope I made us sound, you know, reasonably impressive. But we're a drop in the ocean in the, you know, higher education policy space. So we still have to do a lot of work to build visibility and awareness. And some university members are really engaged in this and put a lot of time and effort. And some university members are, you know, one person who really believes in it and has this remit for part of their job. So it's very varied even within the membership. Yes.
And you obviously persuaded research funders to fund you. How did that travel over time in terms of getting research funders to open up to funding this additionally or separately? Because we're on that journey now. We heard about some of it earlier. Research Ireland are beginning to fund, other funders are funding different aspects. They're much more interested than they were, but there's obviously a journey to travel.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really important having that support. And we probably started 5 years ago. So there's a bit of a hearts and minds effort. We were very fortunate, I think, in one of my predecessors persuading the Economic and Social Sciences Research Council to give us a very tiny sum of money. It was £20,000 or £30,000, but it enabled us to commission some work looking at what a sustainable operating model for UPenn would look like. And that was useful in and of itself. But I think really it just also meant we were suddenly having a conversation with the funder. And we have benefited, I think, from the broader climate. So ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, has been really quite committed to driving this agenda forward. I was really struck, actually, a lot of the rhetoric we heard from Research Ireland is quite similar to how ESRC describes itself. So I think there was a right time, right place element there. But the other thing was that Research England had been established, which provides institutional block grants for research to universities. And I think partly on the back of some of the work that UCL have been doing, partly on the back of this awareness of academic policy engagement as something that was becoming more of interest, Research England introduced the Policy Support Fund. So these are again, sort of sums of money, they vary, but given to institutions to support this work. So we were starting to see a more fertile environment, and that enabled us to go to both Research England, and they have a particular fund to develop ideas that are designed to deliver collective benefit across the sector. So we started talking to them about, was UPenn that kind of idea for them? Would they welcome a proposal? And they were very encouraging. But at the same time, we talked to the SRC about the fact that we knew this chimed with their agenda. And so one of the things I'm most pleased about actually in terms of the money that we've got is it's cross-council. So most of it comes from Research England. Thank you very much, Research England. But actually we have two strands, one directly from the ESRC and one from UKRI cross-cutting funds. And the reason I emphasise that is because I think that's a signal of us across UKRI intent. But I mean, that was probably a 5-year journey, and it took more than 12 months to develop the proposal, to bring the UPenn network with us, to bring policy partners with us, you know, to say, is this something you will engage with if we get it, and to develop the proposal so it satisfied UKRI.
Maybe a final question before we open it up. Just have you any reflections and thoughts on the positioning of knowledge brokers and their professionalisation? Because this is effectively a new type of group of people, diverse group of people, but a new type. So your thoughts and reflections on that?
I do. I feel like it's like I slipped you a tenner to ask that question. So we published a report that I wrote with some colleagues last year on this very question, actually. These were all available on either the Capabilities in Academic Policy Engagement website, cape.ac.uk, or the UPenn one, which is upenn.ac.uk. I think this is a profession that has emerged, you know, slightly invisibly, in that there are now lots and lots and lots of people in UK universities doing it. There is also, I think, a fairly strong contingent of people in policy roles doing it. So my first thought is actually, I am wary of suggesting it's a dedicated standalone profession in and of itself. I'm slightly wary of falling into the potential trap of almost saying that we need to create a new industry for its own sake. What I think we do need to do is recognise it as a practice, as expertise, you know, as a dedicated skill set. But I think it can be held by academic colleagues. It can be held like people like me who don't really know what we are anymore. It can be held by professional services colleagues, and it can be held by policy colleagues. One of the things we did a couple of years ago was convene a network. We called it the Policy Knowledge Brokers Forum, which is really snappy. But it brought people in different UK government departments and across Parliament in those roles together for the first time. And it was really powerful because it helped them to recognise it. I'm just going to say one more thing, because this is my absolute favourite anecdote, and you've given me an opportunity to tell it. It's short, I promise. At our conference last year, we invited Angela McLean, who's the current government chief scientific advisor, along. And we worked very closely with Go Science and with her team. And they had spent a long time very patiently explaining to Angela what a knowledge broker was, what a knowledge mobiliser was. So I am forever grateful to Carrie Aston in her team who did this. And so when Angela gave a really great speech at our conference, she then said at one point, and I've now had a discussion, and I understand knowledge mobilisation, and I understand what you're all trying to do, and I'm a knowledge mobiliser too. And it was this moment, you could see the energy in the hall was wonderful, because all of a sudden this idea of knowledge mobilisation was being taken up at the heart of government. So I think that's what we need to continue to do. We need to see it as a broad church and a broad profession, but it's dedicated expertise. Not everybody has it. We need to develop it. We can't take it for granted.
Yeah, brilliant. We're reflecting on the same sorts of issues here, but we're at an earlier stage. And I think it was in one of Mary Doyle's papers for the Royal Irish Academy that we caught that concept first in an Irish context, but we're building on it more as we go along. So, is there anybody who wants to put in for a question? Brian.
Thank you. Brian O'Gallagher, University College Cork. I really enjoyed your presentation. The question about language, and then a question about messiness. So the question on language, you had a slide and you talked about the different ways in which research informs different types of policy, and the word inform was the constant term. But in my experience, research can also sometimes underpin policy decisions, and also moving a step further, sometimes there can be the co-production of policy. And that's where that can be really beneficial depending on the policy framework, but it starts to get messy. And that's where the messiness question comes from, because we've had a couple of, David talked about demarcation. John asked, when does the policy advice stop? So when you go into co-production, you're moving beyond those safe boundaries between research, objectivity, and the roles, and it starts to become messy. It can be valuable, it can be dangerous. So your reflections on it.
Before you come in, I look for a couple more. By the way, that's coming from a co-producer. Anybody else? Okay. There's Mark, thank you.
Someone was on the receiving end of some of that messiness, Brian. But Sarah, can I ask you a question? Apologies for being late in for this presentation, because I was actually talking to parliamentarians around the globe in the health area why they should be looking at evidence. But my question is, and it comes back to the comment that Barry made earlier on, and that was about he described himself as a policy advisor. So we have this concept in terms of policymakers being uniform. We don't consider all scientists to be the same, whether they're the pure sciences or humanities or social sciences, but yet we consider policymakers to be all uniform. If you could comment on that. Myself and Brian had this conversation recently about, policy advisors, decision makers who are the politicians, either the ministers or the parliamentarians, but also those that are implementing policy, which a lot of times are agencies and so forth, and the different nuances in engaging with those three very distinct and different communities.
I'm just behind you. And by the way, before you come in, Mark, that's Dennis Naughton, former minister and current consultant in this area and advisor more generally on research results. Mark.
Thank you, Sarah. So, a couple of questions. One of the relationship between collaboration across institutions and competition across institutions. That's obviously something that's very big, and even competition within institutions. So how do you handle and navigate that, and whether the UK incentive structures have actually softened to the point where cross-institutional collaboration is useful? And secondly of all, I suppose the bigger question for me, if you start today, I'm sure you've obviously been on a really long journey, and that gestation has been part of the success you've had because it's been a process that you've just dealt your way forward with. We're obviously at an earlier stage now, and trying to expedite things at an accelerated pace, drawing upon experience from other jurisdictions. Is it possible to expedite and expedite? Do we just have to go that journey and find our own way? And then, if it is possible to take lessons, if you were to do it again, what would be the 2 or 3 bits of advice you'd give to us?
Well, those are fabulous questions, but my God, right, okay. Love the question about messiness. You're dead right, I think. So I have probably used evidence informed for 10 years or so because I was very wary of what we used to say, which was evidence-based. I just don't think that is, I think it's for the birds. It doesn't exist because there are so many other factors in decision-making. But your question is making me wonder whether we need a new language, because I think I am with you. I don't think everybody probably is comfortable in that co-production space. But I think increasingly, we need to go beyond saying, well, evidence is one part of the into policy and there are all these other considerations. I mean, this is why I suppose I'm so obsessed a bit with the role of universities, because I think universities can play that broader conveners. We are obviously, knowledge providers, but we can bring partners together. We can engage with different sectors. We can have the conversations that are actually about what's the academic evidence, what are other forms of evidence, what are the other policy considerations. And more than that, I think we can create the spaces in which you can consider not just what the evidence tells you, but what its implications might be for different options, what the sort of the judgments of that might be. I think where I'm in total alignment with David is, decision makers make the decision because that's what they're elected to do. That's the point of a democracy. But I am actually quite happy in that messy space where we do look at thinking about co-production. I think it's probably where most of the magic happens. And I think it's probably what the policy challenges we're facing now require. I guess the
health warning to that is if you create those spaces, you've really got to make sure they are not just the old boys network, no offence, meeting in those spaces. You know, we really need to make sure that those spaces are inclusive, that they are diverse. But I think that's probably the direction of travel if we want to really build productive and constructive relationships with policymakers. But I don't think it's for everybody. And in terms of, policymakers, what's that? I can never say heterogeneous. The first time I successfully said it in public, but I think it's really easy and lazy, and I do it all the time. I've been having this debate with a really good colleague of mine in the Ministry of Justice in the UK, who has written a brilliant blog, if you're interested, on precisely this topic. The fact that actually it's a massive catch-all term, and it's, you know, if you try and think about local government, regional government, national government, parliament, public bodies, arm's length agencies, you know, my goodness. So I think you're right. And I think the difficulty, I suppose, is that people are perhaps naturally inclined a little bit to go where they think the biggest glory is, which is often national government. And we maybe don't have the patience actually to understand that nuance that you were talking about. So what are the different needs that exist in all those different parts of the policymaking ecosystem? So that's, I think, a really big area of work we all need to get a bit comfortable with. And there's an opportunity potentially, I think, in the UK as we see our landscape of government shifting and much more focus on certainly English devolution and on building capacity for government in different parts of the system. I think that's going to require us actually to be a lot more subtle and nuanced in what we're doing. But you're right to flag it, and I hope you'll continue to pick it up when people like me bandy it about lazily, because it's very bad practice. And then, Mark, you were greedy and you had two questions. One was incentivising collaboration and the tension with competition, and one was, can we do anything to accelerate this work? So incentivising collaboration is, I think, most easily done by funding. It's a boring answer, I'm sorry, but I think it just, you know, universities have evolved these very sophisticated, complex systems, most of which are about maximising funding. So if we have a big funding system that says it's time to stop squabbling and it's time to work together, I think that's very effective. And you can see that emerging at different points of the UK system. My personal view is I'd like to see a little more of that, a bit more proactive shaping of that collaboration. But I think it's something certainly UK are looking at more effectively. I don't know if we'll ever get away though from the kind of cutthroat business of certainly securing research funding entirely. So perhaps we just have to learn to sit at ease with that tension and not see it as a binary divide. It's not all or nothing. We can do a bit of both. And that's probably where we are. But I think it's maybe why having slightly more neutral actors or conveners or networks or whatever, something like UPenn can do some of the collaborating that perhaps individual universities can't. And that's not to say everybody needs a UPenn, but perhaps every system needs some kind of neutral space in which to talk about collaboration and not competition. And then, can it be accelerated? I'm not sure culturally very much, because I think this is quite a long journey, and I think you need to take people with you. And I really don't think it's something you can do to people. I think it's something you build, awareness of and build support for. That said, I think in my early days at UCL, if I'd have asked for a bit more money and a bit more support to do stuff, I would have done it a bit quicker. So I think you can accelerate it to some degree, and maybe you focus the acceleration on what are the kind of the practical and the structural, obstacles that we can get hold of that can be solved with money. But I think that cultural piece, which is really important, and it's not just about universities, that's what I've been talking about, it's about the broader ecosystem as well. I think that does take time. And beyond that, I think it takes, demonstration of value. We've been able to develop UPenn partly because we've proved that we can somehow be useful. And some of that was an accident, if I'm honest, we've been lucky. But definitely showing that you have use and value is the best way, I think, to do the hearts and minds.
Okay. It's really a privilege that you've been with us today, Sarah. It's great that the Newman House Sarah has helped your pronunciation as well. And that I pronounce one more word. We really do think that adds a lot of value for us. And we're really keen on the work that you're leading in the UK. I think we have a lot to learn, and hopefully we can engage over time and we can learn things together. But a big hand for Sarah. a 15-minute break now. Just before we go, I just on the collaboration thing, I just really want to say, because this is my last chance to say something today, just real particular thanks to our partners in UCD on the one hand, who we've started this, we're on a journey of working together with them, and we decided to do this conference as part of the journey, and particularly with Ciara and David. And then as we started planning for it, we were talking so much to the department that they became involved as well, and that was just a delight. So thanks to our two partner organisations, because we couldn't have done it without them.